So Congressman Waltz, more than 3 million people, including 58,000 Americans, died in the Vietnam War. When you came up with this idea back in 2019, what was your inspiration?
Well, I actually came across a colleague that was a Vietnam veteran himself, and he just told me that he was going that morning to go wash the wall. I said, wash the wall? He said, yeah, the Park Service, before all of the visitors come on Memorial Day, they literally clean the wall because people have fingerprints on them. They want to touch the marble or bird droppings, what have you. And I said, can I join you? Absolutely. And there was just a group of Vietnam veterans, volunteers on their own time down here helping the Park Service. That was years ago. And then once I got elected, you know, and I saw the acrimony and the infighting, and I said, you know, let's get a group of veterans together, people who really have skin in the game. I think this is important for the American people to see us honoring our forefathers, to see us where Democrat, Republican, black, white, brown, none of that matters. It just matters that we're all Americans, we're all veterans, and we're honoring those that came before us. And it's turned into a bit of a tradition now.
Mm-hmm. And exactly, bipartisanship is sort of rare these days, or at least an effort to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
What made you come out, Congressman?
So this is my second year doing this. I'm a freshman, and this is the most powerful thing I've done in Congress, truly. It's very emotional, and it's positive. I mean, there's so many divisive forces, and so to get together with fellow veterans, all services, all generations, and just actually do something with your hands that improves the world, that honors our veterans, that prepares this memorial for hundreds of thousands of Americans that are going to come here this weekend. It's an honor. And again, I think it's important to show, as Mike said, the American people that there are people trying to bridge this divide that we have right now. And,
sure.
And I thank Mike for organizing this, because I think it's been special for all of us. I think Mike and I both have on these memorial bracelets that we wear every day. So, but this weekend obviously is particularly important. I think about actually one of my soldiers who I brought home from my first 12-month deployment, and then tragically succumbed to the invisible wounds of war and took his own life. And Sergeant Keith Nowicki. I think it's important we talk about that too, because now we have more post 9/11 veterans that have taken their own lives post-service than gave their lives during service. And that's something else that we're working on together.
Yeah, I think of my uncle, who was a Vietnam helicopter pilot, Greg Waltz. He survived, but he's told me about the people that are on this wall. And even though he survived, to this day, unfortunately, he's very bitter about how he was treated when they came home. Sergeant Matt Pacino was one of my Green Berets that we lost in Afghanistan. He volunteered to go on point every single mission, and eventually a tripwire IED killed him. I think about him, I think about his family, and I have to say, I think Pat would agree with me, you know, survivor's guilt is a very real thing. Why him and not me? He was my responsibility, as were the other Green Berets that I didn't bring home. And I just tell myself, I look in the mirror every time, every morning before I go into the Capitol, and tell myself to be worthy. You know, be worthy of that sacrifice. And our charge, I think, as leaders, as elected leaders, is to comport ourselves in a way that's worthy of their sacrifice and in front of the American people.
You mentioned that stunning statistic, 7,000 service members died in the war since 9/11, but it's 6,000 veterans every single year since 2001 who have succumbed to suicide. Do you think that the government and American taxpayers are doing enough to address this?
We're not doing enough. We don't have the urgency. It needs to be a national problem. It needs to be a problem that every American recognizes as theirs, because these are the small percentage of the American people who have put their life on the line and ultimately given their life. It's such a small percentage. It's about 1% of the American population, and there's just too much of a disconnect. I actually think that's a big part of the reason why we see people coming home from service and feeling alone, even surrounded in their hometowns, feeling alone because they can't relate. And so there's so many aspects to solving it, but it can't, the government has to do a whole lot more. We in Congress have to do a whole lot more, but the whole country has to do more. The whole country has to come into Memorial Day weekend, and yes, you can celebrate, but please take a moment and think about the names on this wall, the names on your local hometown memorial, the names on the memorial bracelets of the veterans that you see. Ask them about it. Ask them to tell you those stories, and we should be sharing those stories.
You know, I would just say from a government perspective, you know, the VA's budget has gone from about $90 billion in 2000 to almost triple that with the same results. And that's not necessarily a knock on the VA, but I think we have to start talking about this problem and thinking about it differently. I want the providers to have the full menu, not just drugs or another appointment, but a full menu of service dogs, of therapeutics, of hyperbaric chambers, even hallucinogenics and other kind of non-traditional therapies. They should have everything at their disposal, number one. And number two, I don't think government can solve this. This is a societal problem. This is going to be solved in churches and communities and neighbors and families that I think need to be more deliberate in reaching out to veterans they know that are struggling.
So you're working on legislation together to try to expand health care coverage for the children of veterans until age 26. Do you have any pledge from leadership to actually move this anytime soon?
This is a bill, by the way, that's been going on. We've been having this fight in this country for longer than both of our time in Congress, I believe. And this is something I actually picked up from the representative two people before me who served my district. And this is a bill to make sure that the children and family members of military folks have the same healthcare coverage as other Americans. That's it. It's actually just getting them to the same level of coverage under the Affordable Care Act for TRICARE. And the reality is it costs some money to do the right thing, to make sure these young people have coverage. And because of that, we have not been able to move it through. So we've been working together with this caucus of bipartisan military veterans to apply pressure. Because if we don't apply that pressure, if we don't shine the spotlight on this problem, it will get sort of stuck in the dysfunction of the Congress right now, and it's just too important. I mean,
the caucus is the four-country caucus of veterans, both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, and we're working, I think, I want to say to get that into the defense bill,
yeah.
But the issue is getting it paid for underneath the caps that were agreed to last year. But I do think eventually we will get this through. Legislating's a little bit like, I don't know, like football sometimes. You run up the middle and it's 3 yards and a cloud of dust. Mm-hmm. But I do think we'll get it through. At the end of the day, it's becoming a recruiting and retention problem when service members can't have their kids covered.
Yeah.
Right. And so if they're looking at other alternatives or getting out or getting other types of coverage for their kids, then that's becoming an issue for the Pentagon. We're working with them to make it a priority and working with leadership to make it a priority and get it paid for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of military service members and their families right now in this country that don't have the same health care coverage as other Americans. That is outrageous.
Yeah.
And yet, again, it gets stuck in the typical excuse making, and especially for folks, I think, that are served and are mission oriented and outcome oriented. It's incredibly frustrating when you hear those things and you get the same excuses. So I'm encouraged and appreciate Mike's partnership on this, because it's going to take us breaking this current mode of legislating to solve these kind of problems.
You also have some other areas of bipartisan agreement. Congressman, I heard you yesterday. I heard you pressing Secretary Blinken on getting more visas and helping some of those Afghan allies who fought on the battlefield alongside the United States. He pushed right back at you and said, Congress, extend this program past 2026. Give me more visas. Why isn't that getting done?
We had a measure in the defense bill that we were working on just last night to increase the number. My issue with Secretary Blinken is, regardless of the overall cap, they're still 3 years on only processing 1,000 a month. That may sound like a lot, 12,000 a year, but we still have 150,000 to get out. So do the math. What I was asking Secretary Blinken,
150,000 Afghan allies of the United States.
SIVs that stood and fought with us, were willing to die with us, fighting extremism, that we have a sacred promise to get out and are being hunted down right now by the Taliban. 12 years is not acceptable. That's the amount of time at the current pace to get them out, literally as the Taliban are hunting them down, and that's my issue.
We're in an election year, which means politics get even sillier. How are you going to be able to lift the number of visas to get some of those Afghans who fought alongside the United States into this country when immigration is such a hot button issue?
Well, look, if there is anybody who deserves to be here legally, it's the SIVs, the interpreters, the Afghans that were willing to die for us, for our common values, and fighting for our freedom and protecting the homeland from another terrorist attack. So this has been a bipartisan issue. I don't think it's going to be an issue. It'll be in the next defense bill. But again, regardless of the number.
The number? 80, what, there are 80,000 or more?
Right,
You're going to get that
they're only
through.
processing now 12,000 a year. And these are people that were already in the system. And it's not as though they're kind of hanging out, maybe in not the greatest conditions. They're literally in hiding. They are being executed, tortured, and murdered by the Taliban simply for working with the United States. I had the brother of one of my interpreters who we got out. The Taliban hunted down his brother and his cousin. They drug him behind a truck through the village to death to send a message, don't you ever work with America again. That's happening right now as we speak. And taking 12 years to honor our promise is just simply unacceptable.
But you both believe that this will get done in the coming year, because the program expires 2026.
Yeah, I'm confident.
And this has been something that, again, this four-country caucus has really been focused on for several years now. And to your question, your point, Margaret, we have to figure out how to both apply pressure on something that's existential to our values, I think our American values of keeping faith with our allies, but also turn down the temperature and remove these things that should not be partisan, that should not be divisive, remove them from this really toxic rhetoric that's starting to dominate so much of at least the media coverage of Congress. I mean, last night we were up till very late in a very productive, mostly boring defense bill markup that happens once a year. And the American people should see more of that. We disagreed on principle, on policy, and then we came together and actually had a standing ovation late last night.
And the bill came out, 59-1,
yeah.
Something along those lines. That never happens anymore. And there's going to be contentious issues. I think the Afghanistan withdrawal and how that was conducted is going to be a campaign issue. We are going to highlight that failure on this administration, certainly from my perspective, in a campaign year. But at the same time, we can work to still honor our promises to the Afghans and press the administration to do the right thing.
So to that point, I know you were up in New York with Donald Trump in his court case there. Can you get Mr. Trump to support your effort here? Because that would make a difference, wouldn't it, in getting other Republicans on board?
Oh, he is not only we introduced and had some of our Afghan allies with him. We've had the 13 Abbey Gate Gold Star families with him. He's promised them directly to release all the tapes, all the transcripts, all the emails, just full transparency so that they have some closure. They still to this day have questions about how their service member died, why they were in the position that they were in, and what have you. So I'm confident he'll be completely supportive, not only transparency for them, but honoring our promises to our allies.
But on the visas, will he bring those Afghans to America?
And on the visas too, that's right. That's right.
Because
that's legal. I mean, that is legal immigration. And if you talk about anyone who is, this isn't just some kind of lottery, as our current system is. These were people that were willing to fight and die for America. Absolutely will honor those promises, and I'm confident he will as well.
For both of you, neither of the two presidential candidates have served in uniform. Biden received 5 draft deferments from Vietnam, Trump 5 draft deferments as well. What do you think your past service does for your thinking? Why do you think it's important for leadership?
It's essential to have people that have been on the receiving end of foreign policy at the table, especially with the 58,000 names behind us, to keep in mind that every one of these decisions has tremendous human consequences for the service members, for their families, and there's not enough of that right now. both in the presidential candidates and in Congress. I mean, we're working to get more military veterans and others who've done real national service.
Why do you think the number serving is so low? It's less than 1% of the population is active duty.
Yes, in Congress at least we're getting the number up closer to 20%.
We've increased it for the first time in 40 years.
Yeah.
Just this congressional cycle.
But in terms of the divide between 99% of Americans who aren't serving and the 1%, that is deeply problematic as a democracy. When you lose touch between those that are fighting our wars and their families and everyone else, that's something so essential that we have to figure out how to bring folks together and get more folks serving. So that's, again, another thing that we're focused on. A lot of the work we did last night on the defense bill is recruiting. Every service has been challenged on recruiting numbers, and we've been pushing in a bunch of directions to say that is not acceptable to the Department of Defense, and we're starting to see the numbers come up.
And service doesn't just have to be in the military. And one of the things that we're both adamant and advocates of is getting us back to national service as a country. That's not a draft, that doesn't necessarily have to be in uniform, but it could be with the national park, inner city tutoring, elderly care. But how do we get young people out in an environment where they're learning leadership, discipline, followership, serving a cause bigger than themselves, and with fellow Americans who may not look or come from the same backgrounds as them? I think there's ways we can incentivize that. You know, people here are talking about just giving away college or just eliminating debt. Well, how about the American taxpayer gets something in exchange for that in terms of service? You graduate high school, you go serve a year or two, maybe it's FEMA, maybe it's the Peace Corps, and then you get some type of benefit. So I think we need to rethink service as a country. And also in the defense bill, we've expanded junior ROTC in high schools, where you get those positive male and female role models, you get those life skills, you get those leadership and teamwork skills. I think that will make a difference. And the vast majority of the expansion of junior ROTC in high schools will happen in minority majority high schools, where we've had the most problems with recruiting.
I was looking at a Pentagon study that said 1 in 4 active duty service members suffer from food insecurity. And then within that subset, there were over 120,000 dealing with extreme food insecurity. How is that possible in America right now?
It's a disgrace. We have soldiers, I had this in my unit when we were deployed overseas in combat, their families were home on food stamps using SNAP benefits. So one of the things we've done the last several years is raise baseline pay significantly.
For the most junior.
For the most junior soldiers who are the most left behind right now. Raise housing, basic allowance for housing, BAH. Housing costs across the country are so high, so bringing up housing and the quality of life in barracks. Thinking about all the elements of a family's costs, like that's why this healthcare bill is so important, because health insurance is such a driver of that pressure. So again, if the American people knew you had people putting their life on the line for the country, not able to put food on the table, we have to wake people up and stop focusing. I mean, with respect to our colleagues, some of the tenor and the tone is disgraceful when you think about the urgency of just that problem we just talked about. We've got to come together. We have to. It is so.
There's serious issues, and we need serious, thoughtful approaches.
Can you change the tone? I mean, we were hearing about concern about political violence, not just threats to lawmakers and to your staff, but concerns about political violence in America, particularly in this election year. Can you change the tone?
I think that our government's comprised of the people and their backgrounds that come to it, and we were talking about that in the 70s, 75% of the Congress, Senate and the House, were vets. By 2018, 2020, when I came in, it was down to 15%. We've been recruiting both sides of the aisle, more veterans, to say, hey, you're not done just because you came overseas. Your country needs you. We've increased that number back up to 22, and I think it's going to keep 22%, and I think it's going to keep going higher. People with real skin in the game. If just a few years ago, Margaret, we could have been in the same platoon together, willing to die together. No one cares on that helicopter in the middle of the night what political party you're in, right? Then we could come together and try to fix these problems.